Senator Tammy Baldwin, thank you for joining us and talking to Up North News today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. Well, let's start first with one of your new duties. With Democrats taking over control of the Senate, you've been named chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee for Agriculture, Rural Development, the Food and Drug Administration, and other agencies. It's the rural development part of that jurisdiction that sounds like it puts you in an improved position to affect a real chunk of the Wisconsin economy. What are the kinds of things the subcommittee has worked on and the kinds of things you'd like to bring to it as the new chair?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize the moment we're in. And so helping our rural communities and our agricultural economy get through this pandemic, because the pandemic has caused an additional layer of disruption on top of what was already a very, very tough time for our farmers, particularly dairy farmers, but that, not exclusive to dairy farmers. And so some of the food supply chain disruptions we saw early on in the pandemic really bring up some immediate issues that we could take action on through the subcommittee, and of course working hand in hand with the full agriculture committee that does the authorizing and writes the farm bill. So obviously we're going to work very closely with them. In terms of going beyond the current crisis, I think I'm looking at issues of resilience and helping address some of the underlying challenges that our agricultural economy and rural communities have been facing for some time. And then, of course, in terms of keeping our future bright and opportunities available across Wisconsin, including our rural communities, a big piece of that is getting that broadband deployed everywhere, because you're kind of left out of commerce and e-commerce in particular, as well as many other things like schooling and telehealth, if we don't have robust broadband available everywhere.
Well, let's talk a bit about the federal role in that, because often when rural broadband is mentioned, it's either brought up in the context of, say, a governor's budget or a legislature that either allocates funds. And then there are debates on how much of it is, help to communities versus help to private vendors. And do those private vendors actually serve rural Wisconsin, or are they serving the exurbs instead? So tell me more about the federal role in boosting internet speeds across more of Wisconsin, and how we can be sure that that service is getting to the communities and people that need it most.
Well, it's a great question, and certainly I see lots of room for improvement. And so I'll get to that in a second, but there's basically three streams of funding for broadband build out and access. The Federal Communications Commission gives out grants. The Rural Development Office of the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a specific focus on funding rural access to broadband. And then the NTIA has also additional responsibilities, a sort of quasi-public-private entity. And one of the things that could improve is coordination among those three agencies, so that they are all aware of what one another is doing and all trying to work towards the end goal of universal access. Just like when we did rural electrification, we really need to view broadband and access to it as an essential in our digital modern economy. One of the things that the federal government does right now is mapping. Okay, so what does mapping have to do with broadband? Well, we need to have a very clear idea of where there is service, what sort of broadband service it is. Is it robust? Is it weak? Dial-up is not the same, obviously, than some of the alternatives that are available today. And this mapping process has been sadly riddled with some problems that have made, and when decisions and funding decisions in particular are going to be made based upon this mapping, we know we have to get it right. We have to know which communities are served fully, which are underserved, and which are unserved. And so a lot of my recent work has been on strengthening the information and the database that we have so that we know where we still have to fill in gaps. And boy, there's a lot of those gaps still in our state that I'm anxious to catch up with.
It really does get to the notion of having a functional public sector as coordination rather than allowing many different private sector entities to either self-police or not talk to each other.
Yeah, there's a big coordinating role that we can play. I had a conversation not too long ago with county elected officials who were just trying to assess where the gaps were in their own county and weren't getting any answers directly from the telecommunication provider for their area. There is data available on a publicly available database, but still, it can be very frustrating if the parties aren't talking to each other. And we need to have local officials empowered with that information, as well as obviously tracking it on a national level. I would also say that, depending on where you live, where your zip code is, you may have very different type of broadband access. Sometimes it's going to be from a cable company. Sometimes it's going to be from a telephone, a legacy telephone company. Sometimes it's going to be wireless. And all of that needs to be looked at and coordinated.
When we look back at another terrible time in our economy, we remember the alphabet soup of things like the REA and the CCC, and it's pretty clear PPP is going to be the acronym that comes to mind when we look back at this time. Something that's been very popular but has not always gone very smoothly. You and your colleagues have urged the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration to ensure, for example, that more farmers are eligible for loans through the Paycheck Protection Program. What's been the issue, and how should the SBA and others go about fixing it?
Well, to paint the whole picture, at the very beginning of the pandemic, when the shutdowns were beginning, and small businesses were clearly going to have huge disruptions, many of them, if not most of them. The Paycheck Protection Program was stood up fairly quickly, and brand new program. Not surprisingly, in the earlier rounds, we noticed some problems right away, and have been working to fix them along the way. And we had a recent opportunity to do just that with legislation, COVID relief legislation that passed late last year. I worked across the aisle with a colleague to really try to address the problems that small family farms have been facing in accessing the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program. Loans in that program were based either on payroll or net profits, net revenues from the prior year. Well, think about many of our typical family farms. They might not have any payroll. It's the family members who work the farm. And then think about the struggles that we had, particularly in dairy, in recent years, where the price for milk was so low that oftentimes there weren't any net profits. Our dairy farmers work so hard, and they have good years, they have bad years, but if you base everything on their proceeds from 2019, I met a couple from Withee, Wisconsin, who got qualified for an $80 PPP loan, 80. That obviously is not enough to make a huge difference. But we fought, and this was with Senator John Thune from South Dakota. He and I fought to allow farmers to be able to represent what their gross proceeds were, the gross revenues from the prior year. That gave a much better picture and allowed qualification for PPP loans. And that is happening right now, which is very encouraging. We're joining forces again to try to deal with some additional snags in the PPP program that affect farmers, and hopefully we'll be successful on that too.
Over the years, you frequently talk up the need to strengthen Made in America requirements for federal agencies. Even this week, you've introduced a new bill making it harder for federal agencies to use waivers to get around these Buy American requirements. Are there specific sectors in Wisconsin that stand to benefit most from this? And are there examples that you carry around of things that have been said to you around the state about the importance of tightening up these rules?
Yeah, there's no question that Buy America is a really big boon to a state like Wisconsin, where we grow things and make things. That's what we're known for. We're known for our beer and our brats and our motorcycles and bicycles and so many other things, our ships and our engines. We make things in Wisconsin, and Buy America policies help assure that, specifically with regard to being good stewards of our tax dollars, that we are using tax dollars, whether it's government procurement or contracting or funding infrastructure, to support US jobs and US products. And as you note, almost every area of contracting or procurement, et cetera, has the ability to waive the Buy America provisions. But it's done, and it has historically been done, in a very opaque way. And so the Make It in America Act that I joined is a bipartisan bill that we introduced today. That will make the waiver process transparent and public, so that we can, first of all, see how much the waivers have almost gobbled up the underlying rule, but also it allows small and medium-sized businesses to say, hey, I could make that. I could make it in America in Wisconsin. And so it really starts up a process to allow some of our businesses to compete in ways that they didn't know perhaps were even possible before, because this was such a secretive process.
All right. And then finally, quickly, it's clear that Senate Republicans are not going to prioritize bipartisan votes on some big ticket items like the president's stimulus proposal, even cabinet nominations. In fact, several of your colleagues still appear to be litigating the last election and trying to undermine confidence in the voting. So it seems like every vote is going to be a grind to get to 50 plus the vice president. But what's your own expectation for productivity out of the Senate during President Biden's first 100 days and beyond?
Well, I will say that now that the impeachment trial is behind us, the Senate is fully focused on two major things. One is passing Biden's American Rescue Plan, which deals with many of the unresolved issues relating to the pandemic, and confirming Joe Biden's nominees for cabinet positions and sub-cabinet positions. And, we'll get to ambassadorships and things like that very shortly. I will tell you that some of those votes for cabinet posts have been quite bipartisan, both in committee and on the Senate floor. So that bodes well for our working together. I'm sure not all of them will be, but so far I've been encouraged by many of the first out of the gate. And then we're going to be working in the Senate probably all of next week on the American Rescue Plan. The House is going to finish its work, we hope, this week. And we know that that is very urgent, because so many of the programs that exist to help us through this pandemic will expire on March 14th. And we just don't want to see that uncertainty and that gap occur again. And so we're going to be very focused on that. I hope that can be bipartisan. I know that there's so many provisions that are supported by Republicans. We just don't know at the end whether they'll come on board or not. But I think we're going to get off to a strong start, and we have a lot before us after that.
Senator Tammy Baldwin, thank you so much for your time. Best wishes. Thanks for visiting with us.
Thank you for having me.